back to today's video. Today is Thursday, August 14th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the Alaska Senate race and Senator Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader in the United States Senate, now courting Mary Peltola in the Alaska Senate race, hoping to find a top-tier recruit in a state that nobody was looking at twice in this midterm cycle that they now might, should Mary Peltola decide to run for Senate. Now, the 2026 races for U.S. Senate have been particularly difficult for the Democratic Party looking at the Senate math. Democrats look very often to midterm elections where they are the party out of power as an opportunity to win back said political power. When you think about the 2026 Senate races, you have to understand that a lot of this comes into the fact that we are not working with the same political dynamics that many of these senators and candidates that would like to run for Senate started out with sometimes decades ago. And that was the idea that parties can win in states they don't normally win on the presidential level, at least to a point where they are formidable candidates and can win an election cycle. Now, partisanship and polarization has taken full force, and it has been extraordinarily difficult for opposition party members to win in areas and win in states that currently are owned and won by overwhelming margins by certain political candidates. For instance, when you take a look at states like Alaska, this is a state that is prime and of interest right now. Donald Trump won this state by 14 points. So of course, Democrats didn't really think that this is a state that they could target. Again, the Senate math is quite tricky. In terms of real toss-up states of what we're looking at now with the recent announcement that Sherrod Brown is running for Senate again, you really find that a lot of these states that Democrats are heavily targeting are quite limited. And even on the states right now that are considered to be toss-ups, if you take out all of these states that Republicans currently have, Maine, North Carolina, and Ohio, even then, Republicans still hold the majority in the U.S. Senate. So what Chuck Schumer has been trying to do in the Senate math here is try to make every single state competitive and put the Republicans on defense, even in states that Chuck Schumer and the Democratic Party knows they simply won't win. I can explain a little bit. When you look at this big push, when Sherrod Brown was keeping Democrats, quote unquote, on their toes in Ohio, what this was in reference to wasn't that Sherrod Brown personally was someone who was, toying with this idea. He was being actively convinced to run for Senate. Obviously had his own political ambitions. I don't want to remove the agency from Senator Brown, but when you look at it from this perspective, he was seriously considering a run for governor in Ohio, seemed to be very much considering it, had publicly expressed that this was an option for him, and yet met time and time again with members of his campaign team, with Chuck Schumer in particular, and ultimately made the decision not to run for governor, but instead run for Senate. And now we're starting to see something similar come up in the state of Alaska. Mary Peltola, the headline here is that she's the clear frontrunner for Alaska governor. In a head-to-head race against the lieutenant governor in the final round of voting, Mary Peltola defeats the Republican who's extreme by every metric. I mean, she's more far right than Trump on a lot of issues, and in Alaska, that doesn't fly that well. She sort of reminds me a lot of Sarah Palin, but on the governor level, Peltola is quite popular. She defeats her, according to this data point, by 30 percentage points. Now, I don't think Mary Peltola would win the governorship by 30, but I do think that she'd win it. The Senate, I'm less convinced on. Not to say she can't do it and that she won't do it. All I'm saying is that that race takes something different. It's a more nationalized race, and Mary Peltola, coming off of a 2024 election loss, certainly comes into this as someone who is the underdog in the Senate race. But Schumer sees her as a viable candidate, and arguably, even though she might have a better chance at the governorship in Alaska, she really is the only contender that could even make this race competitive. The last time we thought this race might be competitive was in the 2020 presidential election, when then incumbent Senator Dan Sullivan was running against Al Gross, who was the independent who Democrats allowed to replace them on the ballot in this Senate election. Well, Al Gross not only did not win this Senate election, but also underperformed Biden in the state. Biden lost Alaska by just 10 points. Based off land, Republicans would say Alaska should be a blue state, but the state was a lot bluer than it had been in years past. Looking at the election history of Alaska, the performance here in the Senate level actually wasn't all that impressive. And given based on what the data had said, and based off the amount of money that was fundraised in this district, based on it all, Al Gross actually underperformed what expectations were. But now in 2026, you have a real candidate, not to say Al Gross wasn't real, but a real candidate who can stand a real chance in this election. I think in 2020, a lot of Democrats were misled, and a lot of people, just general Republicans too, were misled about the Senate race in Alaska because it had been a state that had been very difficult to poll. The data had been very wonky on it, and not to mention that this whole shtick, that in a state like Alaska that had been electing Republicans time and time again, that you needed someone who was middle of the ground, an independent who could win rather than a Democrat. But Mary Peltola put that all to shame. In 2022, she won in the state of Alaska by a whopping 10 percentage points in the final round, head-to-head against Sarah Palin. Mary Peltola did what was done and foreseen to be as impossible. She won the special election for Democrats in August and then won a regularly scheduled election in the state that, again, had voted with the Republican Party in the House for over half a century. Her being the first Democrat to win that seat again since before Richard Nixon had been elected president. And so thinking about Peltola in 22, winning by 10 in a year where Republicans won control of the House of Representatives, clearly a very strong candidate, but ran against the right Republican for the Democrats, that being former Governor Sarah Palin. But now in 2026, she's up against a more formidable candidate, Senator Dan Sullivan, who stands in a position of already outpacing Donald Trump in the last election, not to mention that in the most recent presidential, Donald Trump won this state by 14 percentage points. But Peltola is a chronic overperformer in 2024 in the same exact election where Alaska, we saw this state vote for Donald Trump by 14 in the House race. She only lost by 2.4%. That was the margin between Peltola and Begich in this race. That's close. There's no other way around it. The margin here clearly shows that Peltola stood within reach of the House race, that had the presidential race just gone a few points to the left of the cycle, that Democrats would have maintained control of the Alaska sole House seat. But it showed that partisanship really does trounce everything. In a state like this where Peltola still stands today as the most popular Alaska politician in historical convention, she would have won re-election. But in 2024, in, again, this day and age of hyperpartisanship, it just simply wasn't happening. But now in 2026, Chuck Schumer and Democrats think something different might happen. Now, here's my take. If Mary Peltola decides to run for Senate in Alaska, it puts her in a good position and a strong enough one the Democrats have a fighting chance. But it doesn't mean they are the favorites. The race right now stands to be solidly in favor of the Republican Party. But if Mary Peltola goes for it, this rating would drop down to lean Republican. But because Mary Peltola hasn't made a decision on the race, we can't make that characterization. But we know it would be a good decision for the Democratic Party, but her odds at winning in the governor's race, tremendously higher. This is really where Democrats have to do the cost-benefit analysis, where it looks like Schumer might have done it on his half, but thinking about a lot of other Democrats across the country and in the state of Alaska, this is the really big question. Let's say Mary Peltola makes that decision, decides that she wants to run for governor in Alaska and instead opt out and not run for Senate. How much better off are Democrats in a state that is one of the least populated states in the country that they have a Democratic governor? Yes, it might allow her to springboard against someone like Murkowski, where just based off elimination in an early primary in 2028, that we could see, Mary Peltola elected to the U.S. Senate. But that's back-to-back elections. 2 years prior before this one, running for House, then running for governor, then running for Senate. It'll look like she can't stay in one office in a way that voters may not positively respond to. So in a comeback bid, after losing in 24, again, Alaska, very small state, so the House district and the Senate district, same thing, right? You're talking about just a statewide race, either way and either direction that you decide to go in. Peltola, while she has already filed for the House seat, does not seem like she actually wants to run for House in 2026, but maybe there's an opening here in the United States Senate, and it would allow her to not have to run every 2 years and give a more cushiony position. So, are Democrats better off running an A or S tier candidate in the Senate race that might come up short than locking in a governorship that might not matter on the national level to any degree? It's a big question, and one the Democrats should be asking themselves. Because if Peltola can pull it off, this race and the Senate control comes back into fray. Because if you take out Alaska, the Senate math becomes that much easier for the Democratic Party. Not saying this would happen, but let's say a hypothetical. Democrats lock down Georgia, they lock down Michigan, and they win in North Carolina and Ohio and Maine. Democrats actually would win back Senate control. Now, right now, Alaska's not on the radar. And for all purposes, Maine isn't either, because there is no top Democrat in that race. And so Democrats, even in their best case, are at 49 to 51. But let's say John Husted wins in Ohio. Democrats go down to 50 to 48. Let's say that Michael Whatley wins in North Carolina. I mean, these are real situations. Republicans have probably 30-40% chance in North Carolina against Roy Cooper, are the favorites in Ohio, the favorites in Maine, the favorites in Alaska. So even saying it based off statistical odds, Democrats are going to peak at 48 to Republicans at 52. The math here is difficult. But in the inclusion of Ohio, which is what Sherrod Brown has done, rather than a more solid and locked-in race like the governor's race, instead run for Senate where it might not be as easy, but you are laying everything on the field in 2026. A race that we didn't even look at twice in this cycle. Sherrod Brown throwing his hat in the ring makes a huge difference. Even if Democrats don't win Ohio, tens of millions of dollars will be invested into a race that Republicans would have easily won otherwise that might help Democrats in other states by nature of taking away oxygen and resources from other states that need it more. Alaska is the same thing. On nobody's radar. But if Schumer can field Peltola, this race will be one that Republicans will have to invest in tremendously. And here's the thing. It doesn't mean that Peltola is doomed. I don't think she wins it outright, but I think there's a non-zero chance that she does, and that, to some Democrats, is worth more than running for governor, where the nationalized impact will be that much slower. And the idea that you would be able to get to a point where you could block future nominees to a Trump administration, block future Supreme Court justices if given the opportunity, 2026 will be a make or break for the Democratic Party, and Republicans right now are on track for a very easy re-elect to the U.S. Senate, even if they lose 2 to 3 races, because that's how much their majority is right now. But if Democrats can compete everywhere, and do compete everywhere, and Peltola makes this leap, and instead of running for governor, decides to run for Senate, it will make it that much easier for Democrats to see a pathway to the majority. Is it easy? No. But without Peltola in the race, it is a near impossibility across the board. You'd have to really, really stretch and count on a massive state with not as big of a high-profile named Democrat who had won statewide before, like Texas or Iowa, to switch sides and, put the Democrats up. Or a state like Ohio, where you would have the Democrats, even then, Ohio, without an Iowa or Texas or Florida or Alaska, Democrats don't have the majority. They don't have the point where they're reaching 50 seats. Because you throw Alaska, J.D. Vance breaks the tie, John Thune, Senate leader for the Republicans, another 2 years, right? Yes, sets up Democrats well in 28, but by this point, you could be replacing Alito, Thomas, Roberts, whoever, right? Under Donald Trump. You could go 6 for 6 on the conservative justices in the Supreme Court under Trump, especially if the Senate lends itself to allowing that. North Carolina, Ohio, Georgia, Maine, all big asks. Georgia, more so than the rest. But 3 of those states currently held by Republicans. North Carolina last went to Tom Tillis by 2. This Ohio Senate seat last went, in 2022 by 6 to J.D. Vance. And Maine by 8 in 2020. These aren't easy pickups. And even with all of them in sync, Democrats still don't get that majority. So if you throw Alaska and Mary Peltola decides that she's running for Senate, it would be great news for the Democratic Party. Obviously, you'd rather have her win a governorship, but based off what we're seeing, if she goes for Senate, a non-zero chance that she wins. Is she the favorite? Not right now, but a lot can change between now and next November. If Democrats want to play it safe, she should run for governor. But if they are intentional about laying it all out in the field in 2026, it is her decision to make, but she is truly the only one who could make Alaska a competitive state in this upcoming next midterm cycle. And if Democrats are right about winning in the same way they did in 2018, Alaska is surprisingly within reach, even if it seems impossible right now. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.